AM1150 with lawyers from FH&P covering various legal topics.
Well, always a pleasure to welcome to our studios on Tuesday morning lawyers from FH&P. It's been a while since I've had the opportunity to spend time in the comfort or in the conversation with Daniel Shea. I spent a lot of time in conversation with his wife, Rosemary Thompson, maestro with the Okanagan Symphony Orchestra.
The esteemed Rosemary Thompson.
Yeah, the esteemed Rosemary Thompson. And
I have to call her that at home, just so you know.
The esteemed Rosemary Thompson.
My esteemed wife, would you mind emptying the dishwasher?
Yeah, but just, we'll get into the law, but for you personally, the achievements and the accomplishments of your wife, rather marked, and certainly it's hard to find anyone who does not enjoy the Okanagan Symphony Orchestra who would not be singing her praises. And so obliquely, my wife is this, therefore I am thus.
Well, I like to think that behind every great woman stands, somebody who's at least taking care of the house.
There you go.
Yeah. I couldn't be proud of her. It was a great year, a great success on so many fronts.
Just unbelievable, and I think that the crowning glory for her has to be O Fortuna. There were 183 or 187 people on stage at the Kelowna Community Theater. In my lifetime, would never, when I heard that she was going to attempt to do this, I thought that some bite of insanity had, grabbed hold.
Well, it's quite likely that it had.
But truly a magnificent night.
Couldn't have worked out better. And just to sit there in that audience with that kind of capacity on stage and be blown away by that music was just really amazing.
I will admit fully and completely that I had a lump in my throat and tears in my eyes. As that event took place.
Yeah, as did I.
It was magnificent. It was truly magnificent. So with that as the light and sort of happy and optimistic, now we get down into the challenges of life in later stages of life, when empty nesters suddenly find themselves staring at each other across a table and the kids have long left. And suddenly there seems to be nothing left to say. And divorce rears its ugly head.
Well, it can happen to everyone, And just on a personal note, if I could start with, I'm one of 8 kids, and my parents were Roman Catholic, and I grew up in a fairly religious household. And when I was in my 20s, my parents were in their 50s, and they decided that they no longer wanted to be together. And it was unimaginable at the time that, a family with 8 kids would all of a sudden be divorcing.
Well, it was against the very preachings of the church.
It was. And, my father went and actually got an annulment because that's what you had to do to remain in the Catholic Church after a separation.
Right.
And so it's been an interest of mine for a while, not just the psychology of why that happens, but the legal ramifications of how families in that position deal with things, especially later on in life, in terms of, when you're a young family separating, everybody knows what the issues are. It's the usual Kramer versus Kramer stuff where, who gets the kids and how do they pay child support and what kind of, things do they do with the house that they might have that's, mostly subject to a big mortgage. And those are not the issues that arise for people later on in life.
And often, and I'm aware of 2 families. It's interesting as you bring that forward. I'm aware of 2 families that I know where that latter stages in life divorce took place. The kids were dumbfounded.
Oh, yeah.
They were absolutely gobsmacked, to use the phrase. And what came out of the kids' mouth, but you were always happy. And suddenly discovered that their parents were better actors than they were life partners.
Well, parents spend their lifetimes lying to their kids in many cases.
Yeah.
And that's what, fair enough, it's what you do to keep your family going when you need to. But when the children are no longer in the house and the parents, are in that position of looking at each other and saying, so you're that person that I married 30 years ago, and how's it working out for us?
I didn't like you then, and I don't like you any better.
At least maybe I thought I liked you then.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So how are we approaching this? Because there are so many different avenues that we could come forward with. What doors are you going to open and where are you going to lead us through?
Well, I want to kind of walk you through why this is becoming an issue nowadays. And the biggest thing that's happening is that the demographics in Canada are changing, and the baby boomers are now the largest age group in Canada. The people that were born in the 50s and the 60s are now, there's more people alive over 65 than under 15 now. And as these people have...
Could you say that a little slower?
There are more people over the age of 65 than under the age of 15.
That does not augur well for our country.
Well, it's the graying of Canada.
The baby boomers become the big bulge that went through the snake, and it's now getting to the other end.
The big bulge is now at that end. And there's the family law issues that go along with that, which is that these baby boomers, as they grew up, the divorce laws in Canada were changing. Back in the immediate pre-World War II era, most families did not get divorced. It was still a rarity. Up until about 1968, when we had the first original Divorce Act, there was still this stigma attached to marriage that, there's something wrong with it.
It was sacred and you made it work.
Yeah, it was till death do you part.
Right.
Until, unless someone was infidelity or there was, abuse or something, people stayed together. And, you had people celebrating golden anniversaries rather than getting divorced later on in life. That has changed over time, and so the baby boomers are one of the first generations that has grown up without having that stigma attached to divorce. And then in 1985, the Divorce Act was amended, and we instituted no-fault divorce, where you don't need any kind of reason to get divorced.
You don't have to prove infidelity. You don't have to prove, spousal abuse still comes to play.
Nothing like that. If you've decided you don't want to be married anymore, the law is not going to stand in your way and require you to remain married. And that's sort of the bottom line now. And people can separate for whatever reason they like.
So as you look at that as one of 8 kids and 20 years old when your parents were so outside the bounds, and to where we are today, clearly you would say that we've transitioned and we've done so successfully, and it's been a good thing, or maybe not so much.
Well,
what's your take? I'm putting you on the spot.
I'm mindful of the disclaimer you put at the head of the program, and I hope to say something really controversial and step up my game, just so you guys can disown whatever I say.
There we go. Right? Yeah.
Well, it's been a big change for Canadian society, and it's been a big change for societies across the globe as divorce has become not so much an issue anymore.
Guaranteed, almost 50 or 60% of all marriages, ultimately, no matter how they start out, will end up in divorce.
Yeah, I mean, people, I think it's been a good thing, frankly. I mean, if people don't want to be together, they shouldn't be compelled to be together. I think, there's been a lot of societal fallout from that, and you have a lot of broken marriages, and, the bottom line is people live their lives the way that they see fit to, and I don't think the state should really stand in the way of it.
And you and I are not here to argue philosophically, but I still, I still somehow believe that there is a price that has been paid, however, by the children of those relationships.
Oh.
And for instance, my son, who at 23 today, to me the prospects of his getting married and having children are not as good as mine were, and mine weren't as good as my parents, because he is a child of divorce. And while he's rationalized it, and while he lives to me as a whole individual, I think that certainly the time that his mother and I went through colored his vision of marriage and colored a vision of how he was going to spend his life. And I think that is replicated to hundreds of thousands of people, and I'm not sure what ultimately the impact is going to be societally.
Well, I would agree with that. I mean, the fallouts of divorce emotionally on children are severe in many cases. Yeah.
Yeah.
And hopefully, that, many people can overcome that and have happy relationships on their own later in life.
So let's sit down to the table and break bread with our senior couple, or our mid-60s couple, or even our middle 50s couple who stare at each other across the table and realize, I don't want to be here anymore. What goes next?
Well, what goes next depends to a large extent on how old they are, because in some cases it simply doesn't make financial sense and it's not financially possible to divorce. I mean, divorce is an expensive thing. The biggest
splitting assets and so on, selling property.
You're looking at, in many cases, a couple that has worked their whole lives to build the financial base that they're intending to rely on in their retirement. They have a house, they have some savings, they're going to have old age security pensions and CPP income. But they have this nest egg that's of a limited size and is, designed to take care of one household in their retirement. When they split up, they've got to make that work for two households. And that is a pretty stark reality for many people. There are I think the rule of thumb is if there's enough money to go around while you are together and live comfortably, there might be enough to go around when you're living separate. But if you're scraping by and making ends meet, that nest egg is going to be a lot, scraped more thin between two people.
Better one of you to move into the basement.
Or perhaps, retain separate residences to the extent that you can, but maybe not get a full divorce. That's an option in some cases, because the court process itself can be expensive.
If you're interested in participating in the conversation, love to hear from you at 250-862-2525. Daniel Shea, lawyer with FH&P, talking about late in life divorce, late in life crisis, and late in life, who can afford this? Daniel, a true confession. You're looking across the table at a 3-time loser here. And I don't know if it's a function of the business that I've spent most of my life in, because I think it is very hard on relationships. But I do look back now, and I've often said to my son, if I hadn't started my life over again 3 different times, my life would be a much different picture, at least financially. I don't know about spiritually. I don't know about emotionally. I don't know from a happiness quotient. Mm-hmm. I think that I've definitely satisfied the spiritual, but from a financial point of view, 3 divorces are not a good thing to do to one's single life.
No, I think it would be. I don't know your personal details, but I'm guessing it's devastating financially. And emotionally, I kind of look at it from the flip side, which is maybe a 3-time loser, but you've been a 2-time or perhaps 3-time winner.
Well, yeah.
There's a light at the end of the tunnel. There's more relationships to bloom, and that's another thing that older couples often, my mother, who was divorced in her 50s, met a gentleman. They're now in their 70s. They live, in separate houses, but they're a couple, and he keeps bugging her to move in with him, frankly.
Right.
And she's saying no, because one of the issues she's thinking of is he's a fair bit older than she is. Who's going to be caring for him as he gets older? She wants to remain independent and live a life like that, and she doesn't want to get the entanglements that go along with a new marriage.
That's probably one of the smartest things that she's going to do. We're going to take a break. We are taking your calls, however, if you would like to weigh in, be a part of the conversation, either anecdotally or philosophically, at 250-862-2525. Back in a moment.
AM1150 with lawyers from FH&P covering various legal topics.
On this Tuesday morning, in conversation with Daniel Shea from FH&P, talking about legal issues, the law, and this morning really quite an intriguing conversation, personally for me, but more to the point, I guess. I'm thinking that maybe some of you may find interest. You're welcome to join us at 250-862-2525. Talking about family law, but particularly as it applies to the later stages in life, and more specifically with a much narrower focus dealing with the challenges of divorce late in life, and some of the elements, I guess, that are enacted there. You've got some notes there that I think that we should plug into.
Well, we talked about one of the first issues that comes up, which is the sheer financial reality of trying to support 2 households now on that income that was designed to, support one income or one household in retirement. Another issue that comes up for a lot of people is kids, not in the same way that it does for a younger family where they're dealing with the access and custody and support issues, but just in terms of, in the cat's in the cradle kind of sense, where it's, you've got older kids now. How do you relate to them? You have to relate to them as adults rather than as children. And divorce will often take an emotional toll on those kind of relationships. Another thing that crops up for many families is one of the parties, as they age, might require care. And so families are often in the position of, one spouse is a caregiver for the other.
We're divorced. Do I have any responsibility anymore?
Well, that's a very good question. A frequent scenario, a kind of a common scenario, is a couple that's been together for about 35 years. And they've spent their lifetimes together building their assets for retirement.
In sickness and in health?
In sickness and in health. You've got one spouse who was a primary earner, another spouse who stayed home, took care of the kids and the house. I mean, that's becoming less common, but frequently you've got some person taking some time off as the kids are getting older and then getting back into the workforce later.
And so, but if we are now divorced, When we were married, I was legally required, or I was emotionally committed, or philosophical. I felt a responsibility. But you put me through hell. You've put me through a divorce. And you know what? It's your bed. You made it. You sleep in it, because I bear no responsibility anymore.
Well, the baseline position that you're going to be in is that the parties are going to be dividing things equally. I mean, the income that they accrued, the pensions that they might now be earning, those are all going to be split basically 50-50 is the way that things would go. But you can run into a situation where that can be, in practice, unfair to some of the parties. If there's one person who is in long-term care, for instance, that's a very expensive proposition. I think it costs up to $3,500 just to have a government-assisted health care bed here in BC for an elderly person. And that's $3,500 a month. And if that's an expense that one party has, you run into a question of, should the separation help deal with that expense that that person's going to have now that their spouse is no longer with them?
If they'd been married, it would have been.
If they were married, it would have been. Or, perhaps that spouse would have remained as their caregiver. Now that that's no longer an option, how is that person going to be cared for?
So as you look at this, and as you line out this scenario that you just put out just now, I would presume that's happening, if not frequently. It's happening enough that it sort of registers, that it sort of becomes a part of the conversation. How are those things being handled?
Well, we're still in, I think, the infancy of how that's happening. And I actually attended a conference last, I think it was October, November, where, the changing demographics was really brought to the forefront. And the speaker, Mr. John Paul Boyd, who's a well-respected family practitioner in British Columbia, was talking about how this is becoming to the forefront. And it's not clear how this is going to be handled in many cases because, as I said, the demographics are changing. It's becoming more of a problem, but it's not something that's been handled, at least by the courts, very specifically.
But it needs to be.
It certainly needs to be, or if there's some guidance from the courts, or, in many cases, people don't look to the courts for guidance. They simply sort things out themselves by agreement. But those are obviously private and confidential, and it's not clear, in any case, how a given couple has decided to arrange their affairs.
Because certainly when you take the residual anger, you take the hurt, you take all the things that were said in court, you take those pages of documentation that cause a great emotional distress as you build case, suddenly one feels far less responsible for.
That's true. And, by the time you're at the divorce stage, many people divorce amicably. They simply decide we no longer wish to be together.
And that's fine.
And that's fine, and more power to them. But many people are divorcing and in very heated emotional circumstances and, feel I want nothing further to do with this person. And they can live their life however they see fit, but I'm not going to be financially responsible for it. And it's